There seems to be an unknown law in nature that life in the ocean and sea is always far more terrifying than life on land. This is largely the case today, and throughout history, even during the age of dinosaurs, who had aquatic nightmares that would have made you look more hippy-jeepy than, say, a T-Rex or a dromaeozoa. In fact, it's very difficult to find a moment in Earth's history where your best chances were in the water rather than on land. However, there was a very long time before dinosaurs existed when your chances of survival were actually better in the oceans and seas, as almost everything above water, including matter, seemed designed for maximum obscurity. This was Lopengen. This name likely means nothing to you, but it represents the final epoch of the Permian period, occurring between 259 and 251.9 million years ago, meaning it overlapped with the Triassic period, leading people to call it the Permian. It was one of those periods in history when Earth was unfamiliar in almost every sense, including when time was right. Back then, when Earth was closer to the planet, days were shorter than they are now, about 22 hours long. To add to the conflict, geography today is not the same, as most of the Earth is connected to the supercontinent Pangaea, which leads to Africa, the Americas, Antarctica, India, Australia, and parts of Europe, all connected. Only in the east could one find adequately sized land masses that were the keys to freedom from Pangaea, with the largest, so-called island, consisting of today's Siberia, Kazakhstan, and Norway. To the north, you would sail to another island, consisting of northern China and various regions of Northeast Asia. Furthermore, Turkey, Iran, and Tibet were also islands at this point, shelled by the Tethys Ocean on one side and the Paleotethys on the other. Together, these two bodies of water were impossibly large, but still nothing compared to the super ocean that lay to the left of Pangaea, Panteleimon. This prehistoric ocean was unlike anything that had come before or since, and it covered more than 60% of the Earth's surface, doubling the current Pacific Ocean. Just imagining an ocean twice the size of the Pacific Ocean is nerve-wracking and likely means you'd have to dispose of it, like a plaga. But despite its enormous size, Panteleimon and other oceans for that matter were all actually quite dark when it came to understanding what was in them. There were, of course, oceans that developed 200 million years earlier. And if you were anything like a Permian enthusiast, you might imagine Helicoprion, an 8-meter, 26-foot ocean creature that became something of a poster child for Permian marine megaphones, possessing one of the strangest and most unsatisfactory labial features, consisting of key large teeth on the lower ear that were equipped with a hilus. However, while this giant ocean was indeed Permian, it had already died of Lopengia, leaving the oceans rather empty of giant life. However, there were also relatives of this floating ocean. However, none that grew as large as the largest, Helicampodus, was only 2 meters, 6.5 feet, similar to the length of a swan, so it certainly wasn't a huge threat, especially since its teeth were designed for soft-bodied animals like foxes, not swans. Meanwhile, other oceanic creatures, like Sphenocanthidae and Hybodontidae, were even smaller, typically melting no more than 1 meter, 3.3 feet. Euryptoridae, or Scorpionidae, a group of now extinct arthropods, were also present, but not as well. Although they were highly diverse and gigantic during the Devonian period, they now reside on the shores of destruction, having not fully recovered from the Devonian destruction. Only 2 genera are known from this period, and neither a single large one nor an apex. And for the most part, almost every marine group didn't function well, particularly due to the Capetanian massacre, which occurred 2 million years ago. This relatively hidden period, but it was truly more devastating than both the KT and Triassic-Jurassic massacres. Its effects were devastating everywhere, but the marine life blew it up, and so during the Lopengian, trilobites, ammonoids, and cephalopods could be seen, but not in huge numbers or sizes. And things got worse for marine life, but we'll tell you more about that later. At this point, the waters of the late Permian must sound rather sad, but this is an important fact for Solacene, because there would have been no breaks on land. As in the water, the destruction of the Kapitanievsky Peninsula led to the destruction of terrestrial life. However, life on Earth recovered more quickly and, indeed, became more dangerous than before, as the destruction ousted the old rulers of the Earth, the dinosaurs, and thus left the door open for the emergence of new rulers. Dinosaurs were a group consisting of a large number of therapsids, which were extremely diverse and complete throughout the early and middle Permian. But despite their success, they failed to make it to the late Permian. This absence allowed many groups to advance, but one group in particular benefited greatly. Unfortunately for others, the gorgonopsids. These prehistoric animals were first discovered by paleontologists before 1876, and their remains were so horrific that researchers decided the gorgonopsids of Greek mythology were the perfect monsters to name them. While diverse, gorgonopsids still shared the same characteristics, including deep teeth, parasagittal openings, long, overgrown heads, and sharply wide, flared insertions and canines, making them among the first gorgon-like predators to evolve. The presence of gorgon-like teeth made them look somewhat like gorgon-like cats, such as Smilodon, and their bodies were incredibly similar. But these killers weren't cats, nor birds, nor even mammali in fact. Instead, they looked like gorgonopsids, like the gorgonopsids before them, which were closer to mammali than to reptiles, but still not mammali. Along with dinosaurs, gorgon-like teeth were ubiquitous during the Permian, first appearing in the middle stage 265 million years ago. At this time, these toothed predators were very small, no larger than a human's feet, making them one of the smaller animals of the time, and forced them to prey on small therapsids and reptiles. However, as time passed and each new genus evolved, they became larger and larger. This trend escalated during the ancient Permian after the extinction of the dinosaurs, ultimately leading to the emergence of the largest gorgonopoda of the time in Australasia. This trader was not only the largest of its kind, but also the largest terrorist trader from the ancient Permian, with exceptional remains suggesting that adults could be over 11 feet or 3.5 meters long and weigh over 1,000 grams or 453 kilograms, corresponding to the size of a large fox, although in reality, individuals were more comparable to foxes. While they were significantly larger than the larger gorgonopoda, the Australasia were also built differently, possessing extremely rigid, long limbs that provided stability and, surprisingly, speed, allowing them to pull out numerous medium to large-bodied gorgonopoda, which had once been caught in absolutely horrific situations. Australasia had extended subcanines and superstellar upper subcanines that were 15 or 6 centimeters long, providing them with some of the largest teeth in non-mammalian therapsids. Along with their length, the arms were twisted and ultimately scratched, allowing them to easily cut through blood, causing massive blood flow and catastrophic damage to fatty organs. But while we're not 100% sure how Australasia hunted, there are two schools of thought. Either they used tactics similar to those seen with Smilodon, such as slicing their ribs, or they used something similar to a hit-and-run attack, allowing them to assess blood flow and shock over time. Regardless, there's no funny way to go about it, so you don't want to go into that apex trader, which was also a very difficult challenge for animals back when Australasia reached a widespread distribution that now includes parts of Africa, Asia, Europe, and Russia. This toothed foot also seems to be highly adaptive, as it has evolved consistently in a variety of very different biomes, such as the warm, smooth plains of Saudi Africa or the cold, arid deserts of Russia, where it thrived in the diverse, smooth lakes and thin forests that comprise the Peltis Bormaceae, the dominant flora of the late Permian. Because it lived in these cold deserts, some paleontologists believe it may have also had a hat. However, this idea still persists in today's North Africa and Tanzania, where it sometimes grew to lengths of 10 feet or 3 meters. This size simultaneously made it a traitor to APEC. But what was truly impressive and dangerous was the hat, as it absorbed over 15% of the individual's body tone. And don't forget that the recovered hats were also extremely thick and bore hat markings, which are bony contradictions that indicate this traitor was made for battle and communication with a powerful large beast. However, coincidentally, like the Smilodon 250 million years later, Rubidia didn't have a very powerful bite, with recovery data showing a bite of around 715 newtons, only 20% stronger than a wolf's bite. Rubidia could have changed an entire ecosystem through its solitary pursuit. Unfortunately for everyone, however, she's almost never alone. As direct evidence suggests, she routinely overlapped with other members of her subfamily. She consisted of 9 genera, all ranging in size from medium to large. If that's not bad enough, we now think she might not be the safest in the world. But that's not to say she's not the safest. She's the world. She may be the safest in the world. She is the safest in the world. The safest gorgonopsid. Why is this possibly true for every gorgonopsid? How does this fit into each individual's mentality? If we study them, unlike other gorgonopsids, we won't see such large heads and similar body plans. But there were also key differences. Pterosphalians tend to have wide, deep heads, small straight teeth, short bodies, and more compact creatures, and as already mentioned, they were more diverse, leading to the development of hunting techniques in many gorgonopsids not seen in gorgonopsids. There's even a chance that several, particularly canids like Bengalpa and Tucumbergia, were venomous, making them, if anything, the first tetrapods to evolve into venomous creatures. There are also some that are often interpreted as semi-aquatic creatures, like ichthyodocids, while others were entirely territorial, hunting large animals using unusual teeth, as shown in Skylac of Beasts. But of all the pterosphalians, the one with the most extensive reach was Mascarinus, a berry-sized traitor with a blue head, equipped with a multitude of captivating teeth. Its indefinitely large head suggested a rather powerful punch, and paleontologists believe it hunted animals, twisting them with its powerful limbs before withstanding the damage with its captivating teeth and powerful dentition. And to further its legend, phosphorus records indicate that Mascarinus was one of the most prosperous pterosphalians of the late Permian and one of the only non-gorgonopsids to achieve apex traitor status, perhaps even replacing gorgonopsids in certain environments. But, interestingly, larger pterosphalians weren't as successful as Mascarinus, including Megawacia, a 3-meter, 9-foot long pterosphalian that plagued European Russia during the first half of the Laupingian. It's still the largest known pterosphalian, and based on coprolites, or phosphorus-bearing animals, we know that they likely consumed large descendants, which they could kill using their venom. Specifically, some studies of their abdomens suggest that in life they possessed a venom and possibly multiple venom ducts, which would have transferred lethal quantities to animals during combat. However, because the remains of their animals are often in poor condition, this claim is not fully accepted in the paleontology community. From this point on, Laupingian should have been a hectic place, with pterosphalians and gorgonopsids, but even they weren't a complete ocean, as numerous other carnivores remained, all very diverse and unusual in appearance. For starters, you had proterosaurids, which were superficially crocodile-like, soft-bodied, but could still grow quite large, and had gigantic, serrated teeth. Unlike previous carnivores, this group were reptiles, either terrestrial or semi-aquatic hunters, found on every continent except Antarctica and East America. Then there are the craniotsuchids, which were again superficially crocodile-like, but had a huge posterior armature, possibly to help protect against attacks from large therapsids. The membranes of this group could be quite variable, sometimes being fully terrestrial, sometimes semi-aquatic. And while they were typically no larger than a monitor lizard, some genera, like the Ural erpten, could become quite large, particularly in Europe and Russia, where specialists became as large as the family American alligators. Amphibians, or at least primitive amphibians, were also present and lived on Pangaea. And this is frankly the biggest reason why an animal should be cautious around fresh water, as many were specialized hunter-bombers, opportunistically preying on anything they could catch in the water or anything that strayed too close to the water's edge. Of the several extant families, perhaps the least threatening to human-sized animals were the raisinsucids, a family of tetrapods from which living amphibians likely evolved. Each spice had 4 limbs, a fairly long neck, and telescopes similar to those of giant salamanders or crocodiles. The largest member found in a freshwater body was the Uranosentrodon, a 13-foot or 4-meter long opulent animal that lived in North Africa alongside our friends, the gorgonopsids and pterosphalians. They say it's a bad place to live. Then, in European Russia, which also had a large number of terrestrial hunters, an archosaurid was found to cope with the disappearing Uranosentrodon. This was another family of tetrapods, but they were weaker and narrower than Uranosentrodon, but could still grow quite large, with certain genera such as the Melosaurid reaching 10 feet 3 meters from head to knee. With such problems, it's hard to believe Uranosentrodon even survived. But they did survive, and through the abundance of Pangaea, you would encounter a range of Dicynodonts, Cynodonts, Camptorhinids, and Parareptia. Compared to carnivores were more diverse and developed a variety of survival tools. One of the most famous carnivores was Lystrosaurus, a bird-sized Dicynodont that was one of the most well-off animals. It had a rather odd shape, but this shouldn't be underestimated, as it appeared to have powerful limbs and tusks, which it could use to stalk deep caves, providing it with much-needed protection. Interestingly, stalking seems to be quite common, as completely diverse groups, such as the Cystophilids, also learned to stalk, using their broad heads to destroy vast quantities of trees. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, the Parasaurs took a different approach and became armored tanks, similar to the Ankylosaurs except for their club-like legs. Specifically, species in this clade often had large, barrel-shaped wings that extended into the skin and had a high proportion of hard, heavy bones, which provided additional protection. They were also among the largest, if not the largest, ancient Permian animals that could have lived, with the most famous member, Scutosaurus, weighing over 1.2 tons and similar in length to large gorgonopsids. Given its weight and shape, Scutosaurus was a slow-moving animal that relied on its armor to survive. And in its case, its defensive capabilities were enhanced by the spikes that adorned its neck and muscles, so hard they were essentially continuous. This specific gene was found only in Europe and Russia. But as a family, the Scutosaurs had a global distribution. Additional herbivorous groups worth mentioning include Kinguridae, Emidopidae, Bidentalia, and Dwinidae. Like the ancient Permians, they had a single gray line, meaning they didn't have to worry about being seen. Unlike Mesozoica, which was home to giant pterosauras capable of eating literary dinosaurs, the Permians had no dangerous giants patrolling the skies. There were also griffinflies and Paleontoptera, which could have given you quite a fright, but they weren't a threat to larger animals, and weren't very large or diverse, thanks to the collapse of Carboniferosa. Of all the things flying around, the largest animals were probably the Weigeltosaurids, a family of flying reptiles that didn't grow any larger than a large horse. And, while you might have a clue, these guys were only dangerous to insects and spent most of their days on solid ground or, equally, in trees, as their morphology was highly developed for insect propulsion. But, to be fair, compared to the sky, the late Permian had another trick up its sleeve, so to speak, and that was Mother Nature herself. If you follow along, you might notice that life seemed most concentrated in a few places, primarily Europe, Russia, and Africa. This was because large swaths of land were borderline homeless, with an estimated average temperature of 35 degrees Celsius, or 95 degrees Fahrenheit, making it twice as hot as it is today. This decreasing temperature led to severe melting, which destroyed the supercontinent and created enormous oceanside jungles where life was severely devastated. To improve the situation, to the north you see the central Pangaean Mountains, a long mountain range that extends across the entire horizontal length of the continent and created areas that were accustomed to severe jungles. To put this into perspective, if such conditions were to arise today, life would experience a severe decline. And the cool thing is, this hateful climate was pretty dark for the late Permian, because if you hung around long enough, until about 252 million years ago, you'd see Earth transformed into an apocalyptic desert, thanks to the late Permian extinction event, called the Great Pacification, which is an apt name. Despite it being the worst extinction event in history, it's often believed that this Great Pacification began with the Siberian Traps eruption, or was caused by the eruption that created the Siberian Traps, a large region of volcanic rock in Siberia roughly the same size as Eastern Europe. These eruptions aren't like anything humanity would consider in some places. Their average year-over-year temperatures could have been as high as the average temperature of the Day River during its annual visits. And if you somehow had a supernatural load, you'll still likely die from the constant fuming of various gases, which led to drastic oxide collapse, causing several epoxy deposits. And in case you needed more proof that this time was seriously messed up, Also know that some studies report that these volcanic eruption events cause significant damage to the oxide surface, which can increase ultraviolet radiation by over 5,000% in some places. There's debate about how long these effects lasted, but we know that Earth was a very diverse place, with 57% of all biological families and 83% of genera surviving. For comparison, though more inversely, the ultraviolet eruption that killed the dinosaurs only killed about 17% of biological families. And despite how bad things got to land, life in the water actually suffered even more, due to increased temperatures and oxides. But if you took the dip, you wouldn't get fried to a crisp, and you could actually enjoy it, as the temperature in this case was likely hot tub-like, giving you just one more reason why you'd be better off in the water at this time than on land. Thanks for watching.